Ever wondered what happens when a new girl stands up to the toughest bullies in school? Get ready for an unforgettable story. 3 football players thought they could humiliate Emma Rodriguez on her first day at Riverside High School. Little did they know, she was a second-degree black belt in karate. Emma pressed her palms against the cool metal of her new locker, taking a deep breath as the unfamiliar sounds of Riverside High echoed around her. The mountain air in Millbrook, Colorado, felt different in her lungs compared to the perpetual drizzle of Portland, Oregon. Everything here seemed sharper, cleaner, and infinitely more intimidating. At 16, Emma had the kind of understated athleticism that came from years of disciplined training, though her lean frame was hidden beneath a simple gray hoodie and dark jeans. Her long black hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and her dark eyes held a quiet intensity that most people mistook for shyness. October in the Rocky Mountains painted everything in brilliant oranges and golds, but Emma barely noticed the beauty outside the windows as she navigated the maze of hallways in her new school. Starting mid-semester was brutal enough without having to decode an entirely new social ecosystem. Back in Portland, she had been just another face in a diverse crowd of 2,000 students. Here at Riverside High, with its 800 students and tight-knit community dynamics, being the outsider felt like wearing a neon sign. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed to Real Stories Diary because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first period bell had already rung when Emma finally located her English classroom, slipping through the door just as Mrs. Anderson was calling attendance. 28 pairs of eyes turned to assess the newcomer, and Emma felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Mrs. Anderson, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying brown hair, smiled warmly and gestured to an empty desk near the window. "Class, we have a new student joining us today. Emma Rodriguez has transferred here from Portland, Oregon." Mrs. Anderson's voice carried genuine warmth, but Emma could feel the weight of curious stares boring into her back as she took her seat. "Emma, would you like to tell us a little about yourself?" Standing awkwardly beside her desk, Emma tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm Emma. My mom and I moved here because she got a job at Millbrook General Hospital. She's a nurse." Her voice was steady but quiet, and she could hear whispers starting up around the classroom. "City girl probably thinks she's better than us." The usual assumptions that followed her wherever she went. What none of them knew, what Emma had never advertised anywhere she lived, was that beneath her unassuming exterior lay 8 years of intensive karate training. From age 8 to 16, she had spent every Tuesday and Thursday evening and Saturday morning at Sensei Williams' dojo in Southeast Portland. What had started as her mother's desperate attempt to help a shy, bullied elementary school student defend herself had evolved into something much deeper. Emma had earned her first-degree black belt at 14, and just 6 months before the move, she had successfully tested for her second degree. Sensei Williams had been more than an instructor. He had been a mentor who taught that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others but from the discipline to protect what mattered. "Karate is a last resort, Emma," he would say in his calm, measured voice during their final lesson together. "Your greatest victory will always be the fight you don't have to fight." The old dojo smelled of sweat and determination, filled with the sounds of controlled breathing and the sharp crack of breaking boards. Emma missed it terribly. The morning crawled by with the usual first-day routine of introductions to teachers who seemed uncertain how to place her and classmates who observed her with the cautious interest typically reserved for exotic animals. During second-period biology, she found herself partnered with Sophie Chen, a petite Asian girl with wire-rimmed glasses who seemed as comfortable with being invisible as Emma usually was. "You'll like Mrs. Anderson," Sophie said quietly as they worked through a lab assignment together. "She actually cares about whether we understand the material. Most of the teachers here are okay, but some of them have been here so long they're basically sleepwalking through their lessons." Sophie had moved to Millbrook 2 years earlier when her father took a job with the Forest Service, and she understood the peculiar challenges of being an outsider in a place where some families had lived for generations. "What about the social situation?" Emma asked, carefully adjusting their microscope focus. "I mean, who should I avoid?" Sophie glanced around the lab, making sure they weren't overheard. "Jake Thompson and his crew basically run the school. Jake's the football captain, thinks he's God's gift to the universe. His dad owns the biggest construction company in town, so the family has money and influence. Connor Walsh and Ryan Mitchell are his constant shadows. Connor plays soccer and thinks he's funny, but mostly he's just mean. Ryan's on the basketball team, and he's not as bad as the other two, but he goes along with whatever they decide. Emma nodded, filing away the information. Every school had its hierarchy, and every hierarchy had its enforcers. She had learned to navigate these social minefields in Portland, staying under the radar and avoiding confrontation whenever possible. The strategy had worked well enough, allowing her to focus on her studies and her training without unnecessary drama. Third period brought her first real glimpse of the school's social dynamics in action. Walking through the main hallway toward her geometry class, Emma witnessed Jake Thompson in full display mode. He stood near a bank of lockers, surrounded by his usual audience, his Letterman jacket pristine and his blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 6 feet 2 inches, with the broad shoulders that came from years of football training, Jake commanded attention simply by existing in his space. "Did you guys see Martinez's face when coach made him run extra laps yesterday?" Jake was saying, his voice carrying easily over the hallway noise. "I thought he was going to cry right there on the field. Maybe if he spent less time with his little girlfriend and more time in the weight room, he wouldn't be such a disappointment." Connor Walsh, a wiry redhead with a perpetual smirk, laughed a little too loudly at Jake's comment. "Speaking of disappointments, did you see the new girl? Looks like she shops at thrift stores. Probably can't afford real clothes coming from whatever trailer park she escaped from." Emma's jaw tightened as she realized they were talking about her, but she kept walking, her sneakers silent on the polished linoleum floor. She had dealt with bullies before, had learned through painful experience in elementary school that reacting only gave them more ammunition. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to Real Stories Diary. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Better to blend into the background and avoid their attention altogether. Ryan Mitchell, the tallest of the three at an even 6 feet, had darker hair and a slightly more thoughtful expression than his companions. "Maybe we should give her a chance," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "She hasn't done anything to us." "Hasn't done anything yet," Jake corrected, his blue eyes scanning the hallway with the predatory focus of someone accustomed to being the apex predator in his environment. "But mark my words, these outsiders always think they're better than us locals. She'll start talking about how much cooler Portland is, how backward we all are here in the mountains. They always do." Emma made it to geometry class without further incident, but she could feel the weight of being watched, assessed, and already judged. Her teacher, Mr. Peterson, was an elderly man who seemed more interested in his coffee than in learning his students' names, which suited Emma fine. She preferred anonymity to unwanted attention. Lunch period arrived with all the chaos typical of high school cafeterias everywhere. Riverside High's cafeteria was a study in social geography with clearly defined territories marked by invisible but rigid boundaries. The football players commanded the center tables, their Letterman jackets and easy confidence marking them as the undisputed royalty of the school ecosystem. Cheerleaders clustered at nearby tables, their perfectly coordinated outfits and animated conversations creating a barrier between the elite and everyone else. Emma grabbed a turkey sandwich and a bottle of water, scanning the room for somewhere to sit that wouldn't attract attention. She spotted Sophie Chen at a table near the windows, sitting alone with a book propped open beside her lunch tray. Sophie looked up as Emma approached, offering a small smile of welcome. "Mind if I sit here?" Emma asked, though she was already settling into the empty chair across from Sophie. "Please do. I was starting to feel like a crazy person eating lunch with only my chemistry textbook for company." Sophie closed her book and pushed it aside. "How's your first day going so far?" "About what I expected," Emma replied, unwrapping her sandwich. "New school, new faces, same basic dynamics as everywhere else. The popular kids rule the center of the room. Everyone else fills in around the edges according to their place in the hierarchy." Sophie nodded, glancing over at the football table where Jake Thompson was holding court. "Pretty much. Jake and his friends have been the kings of this place since freshman year. Most people either worship them or stay out of their way. I've found that keeping a low profile works best. Emma was about to respond when a commotion erupted from the direction of the football table. Jake stood up, his chair scraping against the floor and pointing toward a table of younger students near the lunch line. "Hey, freshman. Yeah, you with the glasses, did you just take a picture of me?" A scrawny boy who couldn't have been more than 14 was frantically shaking his head. His face red with embarrassment as every eye in the cafeteria turned toward him. No, I was just texting my mom," he stammered, holding up his phone with shaking hands. "Let me see that phone," Jake demanded, striding over to the freshman's table with Connor and Ryan flanking him. The cafeteria had gone completely silent, the usual chatter replaced by the electric tension that preceded either entertainment or disaster, depending on your perspective. Emma watched the scene unfold with growing unease. The freshman boy looked terrified as Jake snatched his phone away, scrolling through it with theatrical suspicion. "What's this?" "A text to mommy saying, 'The football players are being mean to you.'" Jake's voice dripped with mock concern. "Maybe you should tell mommy to pack you a different lunch. This cafeteria food might be too advanced for little boys who can't handle high school." Connor laughed and grabbed the boy's lunch tray, lifting it above his head. "Oops," he said with exaggerated clumsiness, then let the tray slip from his fingers. It clattered to the floor, sending the freshman's lunch scattering across the linoleum in a mess of spilled milk and scattered food. Emma's hands clenched into fists under the table. She could feel the familiar surge of righteous anger that her sensei had taught her to recognize and control. This was exactly the kind of situation Sensei Williams had prepared her for. But it was also exactly the kind of situation her mother had begged her to avoid. "Please, Mika," Maria Rodriguez had said during their last heart-to-heart conversation before the move. "I know you can take care of yourself, but sometimes the best way to take care of yourself is to not get involved. We need this fresh start." The freshman boy was on his hands and knees trying to clean up his ruined lunch while fighting back tears. Other students watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they weren't the target. A few teachers were visible at the edges of the cafeteria, but they seemed to be looking anywhere except at the unfolding drama. "Next time, maybe think twice before you point that camera at people who are out of your league," Jake said, tossing the boy's phone back to him with deliberate carelessness. It bounced once on the table before clattering to the floor, the screen cracking on impact. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, taking the deep centering breath that Sensei Williams had drilled into her during thousands of hours of training. When she opened them, Sophie was looking at her with concern. "You okay?" Sophie whispered. "You look like you're about to explode." "I'm fine," Emma replied, though her voice was tight with controlled emotion. "Just not used to seeing that kind of thing happen without consequences." "Welcome to Riverside High," Sophie said sadly. "Jake's dad donates enough money to the athletic program that the administration basically lets him do whatever he wants as long as he doesn't actually put anyone in the hospital." The rest of lunch passed without further incident, but Emma found herself unable to concentrate on her afternoon classes. The image of the terrified freshman boy cleaning up his scattered lunch kept replaying in her mind along with the sound of his phone screen cracking against the cafeteria floor. This was why she had started learning karate in the first place, to stand up to bullies who picked on people who couldn't defend themselves. But this wasn't Portland where she could afford to make enemies and still blend into a crowd of thousands. This was Millbrook, population 15,000, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and her mother's new job depended on them building a reputation as reliable, drama-free residents. Emma had promised her mother she would keep her head down, focus on her studies, and avoid the kind of trouble that had occasionally found her in Portland when her sense of justice overrode her sense of self-preservation. The final bell rang at 3:15 and Emma gathered her things slowly, hoping to avoid the crush of students rushing toward the exits. She had survived her first day at Riverside High without major incident, which felt like a minor victory. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges, but at least the unknown quantity of her new environment was becoming slightly more familiar. She was walking toward the student parking lot where her mother would pick her up when she heard the voices coming from around the corner of the gymnasium building. Emma recognized Jake Thompson's distinctive laugh immediately, followed by Connor Walsh's higher-pitched snicker. Something in their tone made her pause, pressing herself against the brick wall and listening carefully. "Did you see the way she was looking at us during lunch?" Jake was saying, like she thought she was better than us or something. Classic city girl attitude. She was probably thinking about how much more sophisticated Portland is, Connor added. You know how these outsiders are. They come to our town and immediately start judging us like we're a bunch of backwards mountain people. Maybe we should give her a proper Riverside High welcome. Ryan's voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if he wasn't entirely comfortable with whatever Jake was suggesting. You know, help her understand how things work around here. Emma's blood ran cold. She had heard this type of conversation before, usually right before someone's life got significantly more complicated. Every instinct told her to walk away, to pretend she hadn't heard anything, and hope that whatever they were planning would blow over. But her feet seemed rooted to the sidewalk as Jake continued talking. I'm thinking something public, Jake said, his voice taking on the calculated tone of someone planning a campaign. Something that puts her in her place without crossing any lines that would get us in real trouble. We want to teach her a lesson, not end up in the principal's office. What did you have in mind? Connor asked, and Emma could hear the eager anticipation in his voice. You'll see, Jake replied. Tomorrow morning, first thing, make sure you're both in the courtyard before first period. This is going to be good. Emma heard their footsteps moving away from the building, and she waited until she was certain they were gone before stepping out from behind the wall. Her heart was pounding, and she could feel the familiar mixture of anger and determination that had gotten her into trouble more than once in Portland. Whatever Jake Thompson was planning, she was now forewarned. The question was whether that would be enough to help her avoid whatever trap he was setting. Walking toward the parking lot where her mother's old Honda waited, Emma reflected on Sensei Williams' final lesson before she left Portland. True strength, Emi-san, is not about defeating your opponent. True strength is about choosing your battles wisely, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and never using your skills for anything other than justice. Remember that the greatest victory is often the fight you never have to fight. Tomorrow, Emma thought as she climbed into the passenger seat of her mother's car, she would find out whether her sensei's wisdom would be enough to navigate the social minefield of Riverside High School. But deep in her heart, she suspected that her 8 years of training were about to be put to the ultimate test. Maria Rodriguez was humming softly to herself as she prepared breakfast the next morning, moving efficiently around their small kitchen while the coffee maker gurgled to life. The apartment they had rented was modest but clean with large windows that caught the early morning light streaming down from the mountains. After months of 12-hour shifts at Portland General, the regular day schedule at Millbrook General Hospital felt like a luxury, even if the pay was slightly less than what she had been making in the city. How did you sleep, Mika? She asked as Emma shuffled into the kitchen, her dark hair still tousled from sleep. Maria noticed the slight tension in her daughter's shoulders, the way Emma's eyes seemed focused somewhere beyond the present moment. After 16 years of motherhood, she had learned to read the subtle signs of her daughter's moods. Fine, Emma replied, though the word came out a little too quickly to be entirely convincing. She accepted the plate of scrambled eggs and toast that her mother offered, settling into one of the mismatched chairs they had picked up at a second-hand store during their first week in Millbrook. Just thinking about today, I guess. Maria studied her daughter's face as she sipped her coffee. Emma had always been introspective, prone to working through problems internally rather than talking them through out loud. It was a trait that had served her well during their difficult years after Emma's father left. But it also meant that Maria sometimes had to work harder to understand what was troubling her only child. Second days are often harder than first days, Maria observed gently. The novelty has worn off, but you haven't quite found your rhythm yet. It's normal to feel unsettled. She sat down across from Emma, cradling her coffee mug in both hands. Did something specific happen yesterday that's bothering you? Emma considered telling her mother about the incident in the cafeteria, about the terrified freshman boy and his broken phone, about the conversation she had overheard behind the gymnasium. But she could see the hope in Maria's eyes, the careful optimism of a woman who had sacrificed considerably to give them both a fresh start. Her mother had left behind friends, familiar routines, and a network of colleagues she trusted, all for the promise of better opportunities in a place where they could build something new together. Nothing happened, Emma said finally. Just adjusting to the different pace, the smaller school environment. Everyone seems to know everyone else, and I'm still figuring out how to fit in. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. She took a bite of eggs, chewing slowly while her mother watched her with the patient attention of someone who knew when to push for more information and when to let things develop naturally. The drive to school took them through downtown Millbrook, past the hardware store where Emma had seen Jake Thompson's father loading lumber into a massive pickup truck, past the diner where many of the high school students gathered after football games, past the small park where families brought their children to play on the outdated but well-maintained equipment. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other from their cars, where the bank president knew the names of everyone who worked at the grocery store, where 3 generations of the same family might attend the same church every Sunday. "I like it here," Maria said as they passed the hospital where she worked, a modern building that stood out among the older architecture of the downtown area. "The people are genuine, and there's something peaceful about being able to see the mountains from everywhere you go. I think we're going to be happy here, Emma." Emma nodded, managing a smile that felt almost genuine. She wanted to share her mother's optimism, wanted to believe that Millbrook could become the sanctuary that Maria envisioned. But the conversation she had overheard the previous afternoon echoed in her mind along with the memory of Jake Thompson's calculating expression as he planned whatever humiliation he intended to inflict on her. The student parking lot was busier than it had been the day before, filled with the usual collection of hand-me-down sedans, carefully maintained pickup trucks, and the occasional luxury vehicle that marked its owner as part of Millbrook's small but influential upper class. Emma spotted Jake's pristine black Jeep immediately, parked in a spot that seemed designed to maximize its visibility to anyone entering or leaving the building. "Have a good day, Mika," Maria said as Emma gathered her backpack. "Remember, if you need anything, you can always call me at the hospital. I'm only 10 minutes away." Emma kissed her mother's cheek and climbed out of the Honda, watching as Maria drove away with a cheerful wave. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine trees and the promise of the first snow that would arrive within a few weeks. Under different circumstances, Emma might have appreciated the beauty of her surroundings, but today the mountains seemed to loom over the school like silent witnesses to whatever drama was about to unfold. The hallways were more crowded than they had been during her arrival the previous morning, filled with students catching up on homework, gossiping about weekend plans, and generally preparing for another day of academic and social navigation. Emma made her way to her locker, hyper-aware of the voices and movements around her. She had learned in Portland to trust her instincts, and every instinct she possessed was currently screaming that something was wrong. Sophie Chen appeared at Emma's elbow as she was organizing her books for the morning's classes. "You look like someone who didn't sleep well," Sophie observed, her voice quiet enough that it wouldn't carry to the students at neighboring lockers. "Everything okay?" "Just new school jitters," Emma replied, though she appreciated Sophie's concern. In the 24 hours since they had met, Sophie had proven to be exactly the kind of person Emma valued, observant, kind, and comfortable with silence when conversation felt forced. "How long does it usually take to stop feeling like an outsider?" Sophie considered the question seriously. "For me, about 6 months before people stop thinking of me as the new girl. But I think it depends on how much attention you attract, good or bad. The kids who blend and get accepted faster than the ones who stand out." She paused, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Speaking of standing out, Jake Thompson has been asking people about you." Emma's hands stilled on her geometry textbook. "What kind of questions?" "Where you came from, what your family situation is, whether you think you're too good for Millbrook, the usual interrogation he does when someone new shows up." "But he's been more persistent than normal." Sophie's expression grew worried. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I heard him talking to Connor and Ryan yesterday after school. Something about teaching you the local customs." The warning bell rang before Emma could respond and students began moving toward their first period classrooms with the reluctant energy of teenagers facing another day of mandatory education. Emma and Sophie joined the flow of bodies moving through the hallways, but Emma's mind was racing as she processed Sophie's information. Jake's questions suggested that he was gathering intelligence, preparing for something more elaborate than a simple confrontation. Mrs. Anderson's English class proceeded normally with a discussion of the symbolism in To Kill a Mockingbird that felt surreal given Emma's current preoccupation with real-world injustice and the complicated nature of standing up for what was right. Emma found herself thinking about Atticus Finch's quiet courage, about the way he had chosen to do the right thing despite knowing it would make him unpopular in his community. Sensei Williams had often talked about moral courage, about the responsibility that came with possessing the skills to defend oneself and others. Miss Rodriguez, what do you think about Atticus's decision to defend Tom Robinson, knowing how it would affect his family standing in Macomb? Mrs. Anderson's question pulled Emma back to the present moment. Emma looked up to find the entire class watching her, waiting for her response. I think he understood that some things are more important than being popular or fitting in, she said slowly. If you have the ability to do the right thing and you choose not to because it's inconvenient or risky, then you're part of the problem. Mrs. Anderson nodded approvingly, but Emma noticed several of her classmates exchanging glances. In a small school like Riverside High, where social harmony often took precedence over individual principles, her answer probably sounded naive or idealistic. But Emma had learned from her sensei that strength without moral foundation was just violence waiting for an excuse. The morning passed without incident, though Emma noticed Jake Thompson and his friends seemed to be present in every hallway she walked through, always positioned where they could observe her movements without making their surveillance obvious. It was a subtle form of psychological pressure designed to make her feel watched and evaluated constantly. By the time lunch period arrived, Emma's nerves were stretched with anticipation. The cafeteria buzzed with its usual chaos of competing conversations, clattering trays, and the general cacophony of 400 teenagers trying to refuel and socialize simultaneously. Emma grabbed a salad and a bottle of juice, scanning the room for Sophie's familiar face near the windows. But as she turned from the lunch line, she found her path blocked by Connor Walsh's lanky frame. "Hey there, new girl," Connor said, his voice carrying just enough volume to attract attention from nearby tables. His red hair caught the fluorescent lighting and his smile had the sharp edges of someone who enjoyed other people's discomfort. "Jake wants to talk to you." Emma looked past Connor to where Jake Thompson sat at his usual table, surrounded by his court of admirers and hangers-on. Jake was watching their interaction with the focused intensity of a predator sizing out potential prey. Ryan Mitchell sat beside him, looking uncomfortable but making no move to intervene. "I'm sure he does," Emma replied calmly, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. "But I don't particularly want to talk to him." Connor's smile widened as if her response was exactly what he had been hoping for. "That's not really how things work around here. When Jake Thompson wants to talk to you, you go talk to Jake Thompson. It's just good manners." The conversations at nearby tables had begun to die down as students sensed the potential for drama. Emma could feel dozens of eyes watching the interaction, waiting to see how the new girl would handle her first real confrontation with the school's established hierarchy. She thought about Sensei Williams' teachings about de-escalation, about finding ways to avoid conflict without appearing weak or afraid. "I appreciate the invitation," Emma said, shifting her weight slightly to a more balanced stance without making the movement obvious, "but I prefer to eat my lunch in peace. Maybe another time." She started to step around Connor, but he moved to block her path again, his smile taking on a harder edge. "I don't think you understand. Jake doesn't usually invite people twice." His voice carried a note of threat that was subtle enough to avoid attracting teacher attention, but clear enough that everyone within earshot understood the implications. Emma felt the familiar calm settling over her, the centered stillness that came from years of training in controlled confrontation. Her sensei had taught her to recognize the moments when violence became inevitable, when all attempts at peaceful resolution had been exhausted, but she also knew that those moments were rarer than most people believed, that patience and strategic thinking could often find solutions that brute force could not. "Connor, is it?" Emma asked as if they were having a perfectly normal conversation. "I'm going to walk around you now and sit with my friend. If you choose to make this into something bigger than it needs to be, that's your decision. But I'm not looking for trouble with anyone." For a moment, Connor seemed uncertain, as if her calm response had thrown off whatever script he had prepared. But then Jake's voice carried across the cafeteria loud enough for half the room to hear. "Connor, bring our new friend over here. I think it's time we all got properly acquainted." The direct command from Jake seemed to restore Connor's confidence. He grabbed Emma's arm just above the elbow, not hard enough to cause pain, but firmly enough to make his intentions clear. "Come on, Portland. Time to learn how we do things in Colorado." Emma looked down at Connor's hand on her arm, then back up at his face. In that moment, she felt the weight of 8 years of training, of countless hours spent learning not just how to fight, but when fighting was justified. Sensei Williams had been very clear about the circumstances that warranted physical response: immediate danger to yourself or others, no possibility of escape or de-escalation, and the certainty that your opponent had committed to violence regardless of your actions. Connor's grip tightened as he began to pull her toward Jake's table, and Emma made her decision. In one smooth motion, she twisted her arm in the direction of Connor's thumb, the weakest part of his grip, while simultaneously stepping slightly to the side. The technique was so basic that she had learned it in her first month of training, but executed properly, it was completely unstoppable. Connor found himself holding empty air as Emma freed herself effortlessly, his momentum carrying him forward slightly as he tried to process what had just happened. The entire cafeteria had gone silent, 400 students watching in fascination as the quiet transfer student demonstrated that she was not as helpless as she appeared. Like I said, Emma continued in the same calm tone as if nothing had happened, I prefer to eat my lunch in peace. She walked around Connor's stunned form and made her way to Sophie's table, aware that every eye in the room was following her movement. Behind her, she could hear Jake Thompson's chair scraping against the floor as he stood up, could sense the shift in the room's energy as the confrontation escalated beyond what anyone had expected. That was either very brave or very stupid, Sophie whispered as Emma sat down across from her. Jake doesn't like being embarrassed in front of an audience. Emma unwrapped her salad with steady hands, though her heart was racing. Sometimes there's not much difference between brave and stupid. You just have to hope you can tell which one you're being while you're doing it. The rest of lunch passed in intense quiet, with Jake and his friends having an intense conversation at their table while throwing periodic glances in Emma's direction. By the time the bell rang for fifth period, Emma knew that whatever Jake had been planning for her welcome to Riverside High had just become significantly more complicated. Walking through the hallways toward her next class, Emma reflected on the irony of her situation. She had spent the last 8 years learning to defend herself and others, had trained her body and mind to respond effectively to exactly the kind of situation she now found herself in. But she had also promised her mother to avoid trouble, to keep her head down and focus on building a new life in Millbrook. The problem was that trouble seemed determined to find her regardless of her intentions. And as she had learned from both her sensei and her own experience, sometimes the only way to truly avoid a fight was to demonstrate that you were prepared to win one. The afternoon classes crawled by with the peculiar tension that follows a public confrontation when everyone knows that the initial skirmish was just the opening move in a larger conflict. Emma tried to focus on her chemistry equations and her Spanish vocabulary, but part of her mind remained alert for any sign that Jake Thompson was escalating his campaign against her. It wasn't until the final bell rang and students began streaming toward the exits that Emma realized Jake's real plan. As she walked toward the student parking lot where her mother would pick her up, she noticed that her usual route was blocked by a small crowd of students gathered in the courtyard between the main building and the gymnasium. The crowd seemed focused on something happening in the center of the group, and Emma could hear Jake Thompson's voice rising above the general murmur of conversation. Against her better judgment, Emma found herself drawn toward the gathering, her curiosity overriding her instinct to avoid whatever drama was unfolding. As she got closer, she could see that Jake and his friends had cornered someone against the brick wall of the building, someone smaller than them who seemed to be trying to back away from the confrontation. Emma's blood ran cold as she recognized the scrawny freshman boy from the previous day's cafeteria incident. The same kid whose lunch had been destroyed and whose phone had been broken. He looked even more terrified today, if that was possible, and Emma could see that his hands were shaking as Jake loomed over him. "I heard you've been telling people that I'm a bully," Jake was saying, his voice carrying easily to the gathered students. "That's a pretty serious accusation, freshman. Makes me wonder if maybe you need another lesson in how things work around here." Emma pushed through the crowd until she had a clear view of what was happening. The freshman boy was pressed against the wall, looking like he wished he could disappear entirely. Several students had their phones out, obviously recording whatever was about to happen. Teachers were noticeably absent from the courtyard, probably dealing with the usual end-of-day chaos inside the building. "I didn't tell anyone anything," the boy stammered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "I just want to go home." "See, that's the problem," Connor Walsh chimed in, positioning himself to block any potential escape route. "You're not acting grateful for the lessons we've been teaching you." Maybe we need to try a different approach. Emma watched Jake's face, saw the calculating expression she was beginning to recognize as his planning mode. This wasn't random bullying. This was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to send a message to the entire school about what happened to people who didn't show proper respect to the established hierarchy. But as Emma observed the scene, she realized that the freshman boy wasn't the only target of Jake's demonstration. Jake's eyes kept flicking toward her position in the crowd, gauging her reaction to what was happening. This whole confrontation was as much about testing her as it was about intimidating the younger student. You know what I think? Jake continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who was enjoying himself. I think you need to learn some respect. And I think our new friend from Portland needs to see how we handle troublemakers in Millbrook. Emma felt the familiar surge of anger that always preceded her most difficult decisions. Sensei Williams had taught her that anger could be useful if it was controlled and directed properly, but that it could also cloud judgment and lead to actions that caused more harm than good. The question was whether this situation warranted the risk of revealing her capabilities or abandoning the low profile she had tried to maintain. As Jake stepped closer to the terrified freshman, Emma made her choice. Some things were more important than staying out of trouble. The autumn air in the courtyard felt electric with tension as Emma watched Jake Thompson close the distance between himself and the trembling freshman. The circle of students had grown larger, drawn by the magnetic pull of potential conflict that seemed to override any sense of moral obligation to intervene. Most of them held their phones at the ready, preparing to capture whatever humiliation Jake had planned for his latest victim. Emma recognized the expression on Jake's face from her years of training with Sensei Williams. It was the look of someone who had already decided to commit to violence, who was now simply choosing the method and timing of their attack. The freshman boy seemed to sense it too, pressing himself flatter against the brick wall as if he could somehow disappear into the mortar between the stones. Last chance, freshman, Jake said, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of someone who had already made up his mind. Apologize for spreading lies about me, and maybe this doesn't have to get ugly. The boy's voice cracked as he tried to respond. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. Please, just let me go home. Connor Walsh laughed, the sound sharp and cruel in the afternoon air. Too late for sorry. Should have thought about that before you started running your mouth. He glanced over at Emma, making sure she was watching, then back at Jake with an expression of eager anticipation. Emma felt the familiar stillness settling over her mind, the centered calm that came from years of meditation and controlled breathing exercises. Sensei Williams had taught her to recognize this state, to use it as a foundation for clear thinking and precise action. In this moment of perfect clarity, she could see exactly what was about to happen and exactly what her options were. Jake reached out and grabbed the freshman's backpack, yanking it off the boy's shoulders with enough force to send him stumbling forward. Let's see what other secrets little Bobby Martinez is hiding, Jake announced to his audience, unzipping the backpack and beginning to pull out its contents. Textbooks, notebooks, and pens scattered across the concrete as Jake made a show of examining each item before tossing it aside. Ooh, look at this, Connor said, snatching a photograph that had fallen from one of the notebooks. Family picture. Oh, that's sweet. Big family dinner. Everyone looked so happy. He held the photo up for the crowd to see, then made a show of examining it more closely. Wait, is this your little sister? She's kind of cute. Maybe I should ask her out when she gets to high school. The freshman boy's face went pale, then flushed red with a mixture of humiliation and rage. Leave my family alone, he said, his voice stronger than it had been since the confrontation began. They didn't do anything to you. Jake smiled, sensing that he had found the pressure point he was looking for. Family's important, isn't it, Bobby? Makes you want to protect them, fight for them, even when you know you're going to lose. He took the photograph from Connor and held it just out of the boy's reach. Tell you what, you get down on your hands and knees and crawl around this courtyard like the little worm you are, and I'll give you your precious family photo back. The crowd stirred uneasily at Jake's demand. Even by Riverside High's standards, this was crossing a line that made some of the watching students uncomfortable. But none of them moved to intervene, and several continued recording with their phones, capturing every moment of Bobby Martinez's humiliation for posterity. Emma watched Bobby's face as he processed Jake's ultimatum. She could see the war between dignity and desperation playing out in his expression, could recognize the terrible calculus that victims of bullying were forced to make every day. How much of yourself were you willing to sacrifice to avoid worse consequences? How far would you allow someone to push you before the cost of submission became greater than the cost of resistance? I'm not going to crawl for you, Bobby said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, but audible enough for everyone to hear. You can keep the picture. Jake's expression darkened at the unexpected defiance. Wrong answer, freshman. He tore the photograph in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the ground like confetti. Maybe next time you'll remember that cooperation is always the smart choice. Emma had seen enough. Moving with the fluid grace that came from years of training, she stepped through the circle of watching students and into the center of the confrontation. That's enough, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that followed her intervention. Jake turned to face her, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation to something that might have been pleasure. Well, look who decided to join the party. I was wondering when you'd work up the courage to get involved. Emma ignored Jake's taunt, instead kneeling to help Bobby gather the scattered contents of his backpack. The boy looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and fear, clearly torn between relief at having someone come to his aid and terror at the thought of what Jake might do to both of them. No, Bobby whispered as Emma handed him his chemistry textbook. He'll just make it worse for both of us. Maybe, Emma replied softly, but some things are worth the risk. She stood up slowly, positioning herself between Bobby and Jake's crew. Bobby, why don't you head home? I think this conversation is over. Connor Walsh stepped forward, blocking Bobby's path to the parking lot. Nobody said you could leave, freshman. We're not done with our little chat. Emma turned to face Connor, her dark eyes steady and calm. Yes, you are. Bobby's going home now, and you're going to let him go. The watching students seemed to lean forward collectively, sensing that the confrontation was about to escalate beyond verbal intimidation. Emma could feel their attention like a physical weight, could sense the smartphones continuing to record every moment of the drama unfolding in the courtyard. Jake laughed, the sound carrying a note of genuine amusement. This is perfect. The new girl thinks she's some kind of hero riding to the rescue of defenseless freshmen. Tell me, Portland, what exactly do you think you're going to do if we decide we're not finished here? Emma met Jake's gaze steadily, remembering Sensei Williams' teachings about the importance of projecting confidence, even in the face of superior numbers. I'm going to ask you politely to let Bobby go home to his family. After that, if you want to continue this conversation, we can do it without involving him. Ryan Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Jake and Emma with an expression that suggested he was beginning to have second thoughts about whatever they had planned. Maybe we should just let it go, Jake. We made our point. Jake's expression hardened as he registered what he probably interpreted as disloyalty from one of his closest followers. Our point isn't made until I say it's made, Ryan. And right now I'm thinking our new friend needs to learn the same lesson as Bobby here. Connor grinned and cracked his knuckles, obviously relishing the prospect of physical confrontation. Should have minded your own business, Portland. Now you get to find out what happens to people who don't understand how things work in Millbrook. Emma felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat, but her mind remained perfectly clear and focused. 8 years of training had taught her to use fear and excitement as fuel rather than distraction, to channel the energy of confrontation into precise action and strategic thinking. Bobby, she said without taking her eyes off Jake. Start walking toward the parking lot. Don't run. Don't look back. Just walk. The freshman boy hesitated for a moment, then began moving slowly toward the edge of the courtyard. Connor started to intercept him, but Emma shifted slightly, placing herself more directly in Connor's path. Your problem is with me now, Emma said calmly. Let him go. Jake's smile widened as he recognized that Emma had just committed herself to a confrontation she couldn't avoid. You know what? I like you, Portland. You've got guts, even if you don't have much sense. Tell you what, I'll make you the same deal I offered Bobby. Get down on your hands and knees. Crawl around this courtyard a few times and we'll call it even. The watching students stirred at Jake's proposal, some of them looking uncomfortable with the escalating cruelty of the situation. But Emma noticed that none of them made any move to intervene or seek help from the teachers inside the building. Fear of social retaliation was a powerful force in a small school like Riverside High, where today's hero could easily become tomorrow's target. I don't think so, Emma replied, her voice still perfectly calm despite the racing of her heart. But I appreciate the offer. Jake's expression darkened at her refusal. Wrong choice, new girl. Connor, Ryan, I think it's time our friend learned some respect. Connor stepped forward eagerly, but Ryan remained where he was, his face troubled. Jake, maybe we should think about this. She hasn't actually done anything to us. She's done enough, Jake snapped. She embarrassed Connor in the cafeteria. She's interfering with our business now, and she clearly thinks she's better than the rest of us. Time for a reality check. Emma watched Connor approach, noting his gangly build and the way he carried his shoulders high with tension. His movements had the awkward aggression of someone who was used to intimidating people through size and reputation rather than actual fighting skill. She could see several obvious weaknesses in his stance and posture, target areas that Sensei Williams had drilled into her consciousness through thousands of repetitions. Last chance to reconsider, Connor said, rolling his shoulders and flexing his hands. Jake's being generous, but his patience isn't infinite. Emma shifted her weight to a more balanced stance, the movement so subtle that most of the watching students probably didn't notice it, but her body was now perfectly positioned to move in any direction, to respond to attack from multiple angles, to generate maximum power from minimum motion. I've considered it carefully, Emma said, and my answer is still no. Connor lunged forward with the graceless aggression of someone who had never faced real resistance, reaching out to grab Emma's shoulders with both hands. It was exactly the kind of sloppy, overcommit attack that Sensei Williams had taught her to exploit. The kind of opening that made complex techniques unnecessary. Emma sidestepped Connor's charge with minimal effort, using his own momentum against him as she guided his reaching hands past her body. A simple hip throw executed with perfect timing and leverage sent Connor tumbling to the concrete with a surprised grunt. The entire movement looked almost effortless, as if Connor had somehow thrown himself to the ground while Emma merely watched. The courtyard fell silent except for the sound of Connor groaning and trying to figure out how he had ended up on his back. Emma remained perfectly balanced, her breathing steady and controlled, looking as calm as if she had just stepped aside to avoid a puddle. Connor, Jake's voice cracked with surprise and anger. Get up. Connor rolled over and pushed himself to his hands and knees, his face red with embarrassment and confusion. What the hell was that? He demanded, glaring up at Emma as if she had somehow cheated. Basic physics, Emma replied calmly. You were moving forward with a lot of momentum, and I just helped you continue in that direction. Jake's expression had shifted from confidence to calculation as he processed what he had just witnessed. Connor was supposed to be the enforcer, the one who handled physical confrontations when intimidation wasn't enough. Seeing him dumped on the ground by the quiet transfer student had clearly not been part of the plan. Interesting, Jake said slowly. Looks like Portland has some surprises. Your turn. Ryan looked even more uncomfortable than before, glancing between Emma's calm expression and Connor's humiliated anger. Jake, I really think we should just call it even. She didn't hurt Connor, just embarrassed him a little. Ryan, Jake's voice carried a note of warning that suggested their friendship would not survive any further displays of reluctance. Handle this now. Ryan sighed and stepped forward, his movements reluctant but determined. Unlike Connor's wild charge, Ryan approached more cautiously, his basketball player's reflexes keeping him balanced and ready to react. Emma could see that he had at least some experience with physical confrontation, enough to recognize that she was more dangerous than she appeared. I don't want to hurt you, Ryan said as he closed the distance between them. But Jake's right about one thing. You can't just come to our school and think you can change the way things work. Emma studied Ryan's approach, noting the way he kept his hands up and his feet positioned for quick movement. He was clearly more skilled than Connor, but his heart wasn't in the fight. That hesitation would be his weakness, the moment of doubt that would create the opening she needed. I'm not trying to change anything, Emma replied. I just want people to be able to go to school without being afraid. Ryan shook his head sadly. That's not how the world works. There are always people like Jake and there are always people like Bobby. The best you can do is figure out which side you're on and hope you chose correctly. He moved forward with careful precision, reaching for Emma's wrist in what looked like an attempt to control her movement without causing injury. It was a more thoughtful approach than Connor's wild charge, but it still relied on the assumption that Emma would be passive or frightened in the face of physical confrontation. Emma allowed Ryan to make contact with her wrist, then demonstrated why 8 years of martial arts training made such assumptions dangerous. Using the connection he had created, she stepped in close and executed a simple arm drag that spun Ryan off balance and left him stumbling past her. A gentle push between his shoulder blades sent him sprawling on the concrete next to Connor, more surprised than hurt, but clearly outmatched. The watching students were no longer murmuring among themselves. The courtyard had fallen completely silent as they processed the fact that the quiet new girl had just neutralized two of the school's most intimidating students without breaking a sweat or even appearing to exert herself. Jake Thompson stared at his two friends picking themselves up off the ground, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been respect. For the first time since Emma had arrived at Riverside High, he was looking at her as an individual rather than just another target for his entertainment. Well, Jake said finally, his voice carrying a note of genuine interest. This is unexpected. Where exactly did you learn to do that, Portland? Emma remained in her balanced stance, ready for whatever came next, but hoping that Jake was smart enough to recognize when a situation had moved beyond his control. I learned that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Everything else is just details. Jake nodded slowly as if he was processing information that didn't fit his usual categories. Dignity, interesting concept. He looked around the courtyard at the watching students, at his two friends brushing dirt off their clothes, at Bobby Martinez who had stopped at the edge of the parking lot to watch the conclusion of the confrontation. You know what, Portland? I think we're going to have to continue this conversation later under different circumstances. Jake's smile returned, but it had a different quality now, less predatory and more speculative. This has been educational. Emma watched as Jake turned and walked away, Connor and Ryan trailing behind him with expressions of confusion and wounded pride. The crowd of students began to disperse, most of them talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Within hours, Emma knew the story would be all over school, probably growing more dramatic with each retelling. But for now, she felt a sense of relief mixed with cautious optimism. She had stood up to Jake Thompson and his crew, not just for herself, but for every student who had ever been made to feel powerless by their actions. Hold on tight, things are about to get even more intense in this gripping tale. Can Emma's karate skills save the day again? Stay tuned to Real Stories Diary to find out what happens next. As she walked toward the parking lot where her mother waited, Emma reflected on the day's events and their potential consequences. Maria Rodriguez was waiting in their Honda Civic, her expression immediately shifting to concern as she noted the dirt on Emma's clothes and the excited energy of the students streaming out of the building behind her daughter. How was your day, mija? Maria asked as Emma settled into the passenger seat, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer was going to be complicated. Emma buckled her seatbelt and considered her response carefully. Better than I expected. I think Jake Thompson and I reached an understanding about how things are going to work from now on. Maria studied her daughter's face, noting the satisfied exhaustion that followed successful conflict resolution. After 16 years of motherhood, she had learned to recognize the signs that indicated Emma had been forced to use her martial arts training for its intended purpose. Should I be worried about phone calls from the school administration? Maria asked as they pulled out of the parking lot. I don't think so. What happened today was off school property. And I think everyone involved learned something important about respect and responsibility. Emma watched through the windshield as they passed the familiar landmarks of downtown Millbrook, seeing them with new eyes now that she felt truly settled in her new home. The drive home was peaceful with both Emma and her mother lost in their own thoughts about the day's events and their implications for the future. Emma found herself thinking about Sensei Williams and wondering what he would have thought about her handling of the situation with Jake Thompson. She suspected he would have been proud of her restraint and her focus on ending the conflict rather than simply winning it. Their apartment felt more like home than it ever had before, filled with the comfortable quiet of a family that had successfully navigated a major challenge together. As Emma settled at the dining table to work on her homework, she realized that for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she felt genuinely optimistic about her future at Riverside High School. The next morning brought a dramatically different atmosphere to the school hallways. Students who had previously avoided eye contact now nodded respectfully as Emma passed, while others approached her directly to express their gratitude for standing up to the bullying that had made their lives miserable. Jake Thompson was already at his locker when Emma arrived, and she was surprised to see that he looked genuinely different somehow. The arrogant swagger that had characterized his movement through the school was gone, replaced by something more thoughtful and self-aware. "Hey, Portland," Jake said as she approached her own locker. "Got a minute to talk?" Emma nodded, curious about what Jake might want to discuss in the clear light of day, away from the drama and adrenaline of their previous confrontation. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Jake continued, his voice lacking the commanding tone that had once made other students automatically defer to his wishes, about using strength to protect people instead of hurting them. "I think maybe I've been doing this whole leadership thing wrong." Emma studied his expression, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but finding only what appeared to be genuine reflection. "What are you thinking about doing differently?" Jake glanced around the hallway, noting the way other students were watching their conversation with intense interest. "I'm thinking about talking to Principal Davidson about starting some kind of peer mediation program. Maybe if people have a way to resolve conflicts without violence, there won't be as much bullying and intimidation." The suggestion surprised Emma, who had expected Jake to need more time to process the lessons of their confrontation. "That's actually a really good idea. I'd be willing to help if you think it would be useful." "I was hoping you'd say that," Jake replied with the first genuine smile Emma had ever seen from him. "I figure someone with your training and philosophy might have some valuable insights about conflict resolution." As the morning bell rang and students began moving toward their first period classes, Emma found herself reflecting on the unexpected turn her life had taken since arriving in Millbrook. What had started as an attempt to maintain a low profile and avoid complications had evolved into something much more meaningful, an opportunity to use her skills and training to create positive change in her new community. Mrs. Anderson's English class that morning featured a discussion of heroism and literature with several students drawing connections between fictional characters and real-world examples of moral courage. Emma noticed that many of her classmates kept glancing in her direction during the discussion, clearly thinking about the previous day's events, but too polite to make direct references. "Heroism isn't about being fearless," Mrs. Anderson said as the period drew to a close. "It's about doing what's right even when you are afraid, even when the cost might be high. True heroes are people who use their abilities to protect others rather than advance their own interests." After class, Mrs. Anderson approached Emma's desk with a knowing smile. "I heard there was some excitement yesterday afternoon. I hope everything worked out for the best." Emma gathered her books, appreciating the teacher's diplomatic way of acknowledging the situation without prying for details. "I think it did. Sometimes people just need to be reminded that there are consequences for hurting others." "Indeed," Mrs. Anderson agreed. "And sometimes they need to be shown that there are better ways to be strong than making other people weak." The rest of the school day passed with a surreal sense of normalcy, as if the dramatic confrontation behind the maintenance building had somehow reset the social dynamics of Riverside High School. Students who had previously seemed locked into rigid hierarchies of dominance and submission were suddenly interacting with more respect and consideration for each other. During lunch, Emma was surprised to see Jake Thompson sitting with Bobby Martinez at a table near the windows. The two of them engaged in what appeared to be a serious but friendly conversation. Connor Walsh and Ryan Mitchell sat nearby, both looking slightly uncomfortable, but making an obvious effort to include Bobby in their discussion. "Now that's something I never thought I'd see," Sophie observed as she and Emma settled at their usual table. Jake Thompson voluntarily talking to someone he used to torment and actually listening to what they have to say. Emma watched the interaction with cautious optimism, recognizing that real change was a process rather than an event. People can surprise you when they're given the chance to be better than they thought they could be. The weeks that followed brought gradual but noticeable improvements to the social climate at Riverside High School. The peer mediation program that Jake had proposed was approved by Principal Davidson and began operating with Emma and Jake serving as the primary mediators for student conflicts. The program's success exceeded everyone's expectations, with even serious disputes being resolved through discussion and compromise rather than intimidation and violence. Jake Thompson's transformation from bully to advocate became one of the most talked about developments in the school's recent history. Students who had once feared his attention now sought his help with problems ranging from academic struggles to family difficulties. His natural leadership abilities channeled toward positive purposes made him genuinely popular rather than merely feared. Emma found herself settling into Riverside High School's social fabric in ways she had never expected when she first arrived in Millbrook. Her reputation as someone who could defend herself and others when necessary created a sense of security that allowed other students to feel safer and more confident in their daily interactions. The transformation wasn't complete or universal. There were still incidents of bullying and intimidation, still students who struggled to find their place in the school's social hierarchy, but the overall atmosphere had shifted in fundamental ways, with kindness and respect becoming more valued than cruelty and dominance. On a Friday afternoon in late November, as the first snow of the season began falling outside the classroom windows, Emma reflected on everything that had changed since her arrival in Millbrook. What had started as an unwanted disruption to her carefully planned new life had evolved into something much more meaningful, an opportunity to use her training and principles to create lasting positive change in her community. Sensei Williams had always taught her that martial arts was ultimately about service to others, about using strength and skill to make the world a safer and more just place. For the first time since beginning her training 8 years earlier, Emma felt like she truly understood what her sensei had meant. As she gathered her books and prepared to head home, Emma smiled at the sight of Jake Thompson helping a freshman student who had dropped his textbooks in the hallway. The scene would have been unimaginable just months earlier, but it had become routine in the new social environment that their confrontation had helped create. Sometimes, Emma realized, the best fights really were the ones that ended with everyone becoming stronger and better than they had been before, and sometimes the greatest victories were measured not in defeats inflicted, but in lives improved and communities transformed. Walking toward the parking lot where her mother waited with their familiar Honda Civic, Emma felt genuinely grateful for the chain of events that had brought her family to Millbrook. What had seemed like just another new beginning had turned into something much more significant, a chance to discover that strength used wisely could create exactly the kind of world worth fighting for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.